I woke up to the sound of thunder cracking across the Montana sky like God himself was splitting firewood. And that's when I saw three silhouettes moving toward my barn through sheets of rain that looked thick enough to drown in. My name's Jake Morrison, and I've lived on this 20-acre property outside Billings for the past 8 years, running a small horse boarding operation and minding my own business until the Sagebrush Meadows HOA decided my barn was somehow their concern. The whole nightmare started 6 months earlier when developers bought up the land surrounding my property and built what they called a luxury planned community. I'd been there first, grandfathered in, with no HOA obligations because my deed predated their entire organization by decades. I'd made that crystal clear to them multiple times, but apparently, Deborah Hutchins, the HOA president, had selective hearing when it came to property rights and legal boundaries. Deborah was exactly what you'd picture when someone says, HOA Karen. 52 years old with that specific haircut that screamed, I want to speak to your manager from 3 blocks away, always wearing pastel cardigans and wielding her clipboard like a weapon of mass destruction. She drove a white Lexus SUV with a live, laugh, love sticker on the back window, and I'd bet my last dollar she had a collection of wooden signs in her house with various inspirational quotes written in cursive. The first time she knocked on my door, I was polite. She'd introduced herself with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes and handed me a welcome packet for the HOA, complete with a list of regulations thicker than a phone book. I appreciate the gesture, I'd said, flipping through the absurd rules about fence heights and approved paint colors, but my property isn't part of your HOA. I was here long before Sagebrush Meadows existed. Her smile had frozen in place. Well, Mr. Morrison, we're all part of a community now. Surely you want to maintain property values for your neighbors. My neighbors are my horses, I'd replied, and they don't complain about my fence color. That had been mistake number 1, apparently. Deborah Hutchins didn't take kindly to people who didn't fall in line. Over the following months, I received no fewer than 15 violation notices for everything from my unapproved barn color, which was literally just weathered wood, to my excessive livestock presence, even though I only kept 6 horses on 20 acres. Each notice I received got deposited directly into my recycling bin, and each time I ran into Deborah at the local feed store or gas station, her expression grew more pinched and hostile. The situation escalated when she showed up with 2 other board members in October. The other members were Janet Fieldstone, the secretary, who looked like she'd been born clutching pearls to clutch, and Richard Pemberton, the treasurer, a soft-spoken accountant who seemed deeply uncomfortable with the whole situation but lacked the spine to stand up to Deborah. Mr. Morrison, Deborah had announced, marching up my driveway without invitation, the board has voted unanimously that your barn structure violates our community aesthetics guidelines. I'd been brushing down thunder, my gray gelding, and didn't even pause. Deborah, I've told you this isn't going to work. I'm not part of your HOA. My property rights are clear. You have no authority here. We have standards, Janet had chimed in, her voice shrill. Your barn is an eyesore that affects all our property values. I'd set down my brush and turned to face them fully. My barn was built in 1987. It's structurally sound, it's on my property, and it's none of your business. Now I've been patient, but you're trespassing. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Richard had actually taken a step back toward their vehicle, but Deborah held her ground. We could take legal action. Please do, I'd said. My lawyer would love to explain property law to you. Now get off my land before I call the sheriff. They'd left, But Deborah's parting glare promised this wasn't over. She was right about that. 3 weeks later, I received a certified letter informing me that the HOA was filing a lawsuit claiming that my property, despite predating their development, had been implicitly included in the HOA due to its location within the boundaries of the planned community. It was the most ridiculous legal argument I'd ever seen, and my lawyer, Tom Chen, had actually laughed out loud when he read it. "This won't go anywhere," Tom had assured me. "Your deed is ironclad. They're grasping at straws. I'll file a motion to dismiss, and that'll be the end of it." He'd been right. The judge had dismissed their case within 6 weeks, and the HOA had been ordered to pay my legal fees. I thought that would finally end things. I should have known better. The harassment continued in smaller, pettier ways. Someone filed an anonymous complaint with the county about my septic system, which led to an inspection that found absolutely nothing wrong. Then there was a complaint to the state about my horse boarding operation, claiming I was running an unlicensed commercial stable. That investigation also went nowhere because I had all my permits in order and was well within my rights. I knew it was Deborah behind every complaint. Her white Lexus had a distinctive scrape on the passenger side, and I'd spotted it parked on the road near my property multiple times, like she was conducting surveillance. Things got weirder in March, when I caught Janet Fieldstone actually walking around my barn with a measuring tape. I'd been in the house making lunch when I glanced out the window and saw her sneaking around like some kind of budget spy. I'd walked out onto my porch. "Can I help you with something, Janet?" She jumped about a foot in the air and dropped her measuring tape. I was just. "We need to document the dimensions for our records. Your records of property that isn't yours and that you have no authority over," I'd asked. "Janet, this is harassment. I'm documenting this, and if it happens again, I'm filing a restraining order." She'd practically run back to her car, a silver Honda that she'd parked half a mile down the road as if that made her surveillance less obvious. I'd called Tom after that incident, and he'd sent a cease and desist letter to the entire HOA board. For a few weeks, things quieted down, and I'd started to believe maybe they'd finally accepted reality. Then April arrived, and with it, the worst storm season Montana had seen in years. The meteorologists had been warning about it for days. A massive system was moving in from the northwest, bringing high winds, heavy rain, and possibly even hail. I'd spent the afternoon of April 23rd preparing my property, securing anything that could blow away, making sure my horses had plenty of hay and water, and double-checking that my barn was properly sealed against the weather. My barn wasn't just any structure. It was a solid 40 by 60-foot building with a metal roof, reinforced walls, and 6 stalls plus a tack room and feed storage area. I'd invested nearly $50,000 in renovations since buying the property, and it could withstand pretty much anything nature threw at it. The horses would be safer in there than in most people's houses. The storm hit around 8 in the evening. I was inside my house, a modest 3-bedroom ranch-style place about 100 yards from the barn, watching the weather updates on television. The wind was howling like a living thing, and rain hammered against my windows with impressive force. The power flickered twice, but stayed on, which I considered a minor miracle. Around 10:30, I decided to do one last check on the horses before turning in for the night. I pulled on my waterproof jacket and boots, grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight, and pushed out into the storm. The wind nearly knocked me sideways, and the rain was coming down so hard it stung my face. I made it to the barn, checked on each horse, and found them all calm and secure. Thunder and Lightning, my 2 geldings, barely looked up from their hay. The 4 horses I was boarding for clients were equally unconcerned. Satisfied, I headed back to the house, stripped off my soaked outer layers, and got ready for bed. The storm was supposed to last most of the night, but we were prepared. I figured I'd sleep through it and assess any damage in the morning. I was wrong about sleeping through it. At 11:45, Thunder, who I'd named appropriately given his tendency to make noise at inappropriate times, let out a whinny loud enough that I heard it over the storm. I bolted upright in bed, instantly awake. Horses don't make noise like that unless something's wrong. My first thought was that maybe a tree had fallen near the barn or something had spooked them. I grabbed my flashlight and rushed to the window that faced the barn. That's when I saw them. 3 figures, dark shapes moving through the rain, approaching my barn. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Who would be out in this weather? Had someone's car broken down? Were they looking for help? Then I saw the flashlight beams sweeping across my barn door, and one of the figures tried the handle. My barn door was locked. I always locked it at night because some of the tack and equipment inside was valuable, and I wasn't taking chances. The figure rattled the handle aggressively, then moved to the side door. That's when anger replaced confusion. Someone was trying to break into my barn during a storm. I didn't stop to think about who or why. I just knew I had 6 horses in there, and nobody was getting near them without going through me first. I yanked on my jeans, boots, and jacket, grabbed my phone, and headed for the door. As I moved, I dialed the Yellowstone County Sheriff's Department. The line rang 3 times before a dispatcher answered. "Sheriff's Department, what's your emergency?" "This is Jake Morrison at 4782 Copper Ridge Road. I have 3 individuals attempting to break into my barn on my property. I need a deputy out here now. Are you in immediate danger, sir?" "I have livestock in that barn, and these people are trying to force entry." "Yes, I'd say that constitutes danger." "Units are on the way, Mr. Morrison. Can you describe the individuals?" I was at my window again, trying to get a better look. The storm made it nearly impossible to see clearly, but something about the way one of them moved was familiar. I can't get a clear visual in this weather. 3 people, at least one appears to be female based on build. They're at my barn door now. "Sir, please stay inside your home until deputies arrive. Don't confront them." I was already halfway out the door. They're trying to get to my horses. I'm the only thing standing between them and 6 animals that could get spooked and injured. I'm not waiting. I hung up before the dispatcher could argue further. Looking back, it probably wasn't my smartest move, but I wasn't thinking clearly. All I knew was that my horses were my responsibility, and no one was going to mess with them. The storm hit me like a physical wall as I stepped off my porch. The wind had picked up even more, and the rain was mixed with small hail now, little ice pellets that stung any exposed skin. I aimed my flashlight at the barn and started forward, yelling as I went. "Hey, get away from my barn. This is private property." The 3 figures froze. One of them turned toward me, and even through the rain and darkness, I recognized the distinctive silhouette of Deborah Hutchins' haircut. "Deborah," I shouted, disbelief cutting through my anger. "What the hell are you doing?" She actually had the audacity to shine her flashlight in my face. "Mr. Morrison, we're conducting an emergency inspection of this structure due to safety concerns during the storm." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. An emergency inspection? At midnight? During a storm? You're trying to break into my barn. "We have a responsibility to the community," Janet's voice chimed in from somewhere to Deborah's left. "If your barn collapses, it could damage neighboring properties." "My barn is 200 yards from the nearest property line, and it's built to code." I was yelling now, partly from anger and partly to be heard over the storm. You have no authority here, no right to be here, and you're trespassing. The sheriff is on the way. You called the police." That was Richard's voice, and he sounded panicked. "Deborah, we should go." "We're not going anywhere until we complete our inspection," Deborah insisted. She turned back to the barn door and tried the handle again. "Mr. Morrison, open this door immediately." "Absolutely not. Step away from my property." Instead of stepping away, Deborah pulled something from her jacket pocket. In the beam of my flashlight, I saw it was a crowbar. "Are you out of your mind?" I started toward them, closing the distance. "You're going to try to pry open my barn door." "This is a matter of community safety," Deborah said, her voice tight with that particular kind of fury that comes from someone who's never been told no before. "If you won't cooperate, we'll have to take necessary action." She actually wedged the crowbar into the gap between the door and the frame. That's when I stopped processing her words as anything approaching rational. This woman was literally attempting to break into my barn with a crowbar while claiming it was for community safety. I closed the remaining distance in 3 long strides. "Put that down now, Deborah, or I swear I'll—" The sound of a vehicle interrupted me. Blue and red lights cut through the rain, and a Yellowstone County Sheriff's SUV came bouncing up my driveway, followed closely by a second patrol vehicle. I'd never been so relieved to see law enforcement in my life. The first deputy out of the vehicle was Sarah Martinez, someone I knew from the few community events I'd bothered attending in Billings. She was in her mid-30s, competent, and from what I'd heard, didn't tolerate nonsense. "Everybody step away from the structure," Deputy Martinez called out, her hand resting on her duty belt as she approached. Her partner, a younger deputy whose name tag Reed Harris, fanned out to the side. Deborah actually lowered the crowbar but didn't drop it. "Officer, thank goodness you're here. This man is refusing to allow a legitimate safety inspection of a structure that poses a risk to our community." Deputy Martinez's eyes went from Deborah to the crowbar in her hand, then to me. "Mr. Morrison, can you explain what's happening here?" "These 3 people came onto my property without permission in the middle of the night during a storm and attempted to break into my locked barn using that crowbar," I said, gesturing to Deborah. "I've had ongoing issues with this HOA claiming authority over my property, which they don't have. My attorney has sent cease and desist letters. I don't know what they think they're doing, but they're trespassing, and they're attempting to commit breaking and entering." "That's ridiculous," Janet sputtered. "We're the HOA board for Sagebrush Meadows. We have a responsibility to ensure all structures meet safety standards." Deputy Martinez turned to her. "Madam, is this property part of your HOA?" "Well, it's within our community boundaries. Is this property legally bound by your HOA covenants and restrictions?" There was a pause. Richard looked at his feet. Janet looked at Deborah. Deborah's jaw tightened. "The legal status is in dispute," Deborah finally said. "No, it's not," I interjected. "My property predates their development by decades. I've never signed any HOA agreement." A judge already dismissed their frivolous lawsuit trying to claim otherwise. "There's no dispute. They have 0 authority over my property." Deputy Martinez looked at Deborah. "Madam, did you have permission from Mr. Morrison to be on his property tonight?" "We don't need permission to conduct safety inspections." "Yes, you do," Deputy Martinez said, her tone making it clear she was losing patience. "Unless you have a warrant or probable cause of an immediate danger that would justify emergency entry, you absolutely need permission to enter private property. Were you attempting to force entry to that barn?" "We were attempting to inspect, madam. I'm going to need you to put down the crowbar." Deborah looked down at the tool in her hand as if she'd forgotten she was holding it. She set it on the ground slowly, and Deputy Harris immediately moved to secure it as evidence. "I'm going to need all three of you to provide identification," Deputy Martinez continued. "You're being detained for trespassing at this time." "Trespassing?" Janet's voice went up about an octave. "We're community leaders. We were trying to prevent a disaster." "Madam, please calm down and provide your identification." The next 15 minutes were a surreal blur of watching Deborah, Janet, and Richard being processed for trespassing while the storm continued to rage around us. Deputy Martinez took my statement while Deputy Harris kept an eye on the three board members, who stood in the rain looking increasingly bedraggled and miserable. "Have you had previous issues with these individuals?" Deputy Martinez asked. "Constant issues," I confirmed. "The HOA has been harassing me for months, trying to claim authority over my property. They've filed false complaints with multiple county and state agencies, attempted to sue me, and now this. My attorney has documentation of everything. And you've asked them to stay off your property." "Multiple times. My attorney sent cease and desist letters months ago." Deputy Martinez nodded, making notes. "Okay. Given the pattern of harassment and the attempted forced entry, I'm placing all three under arrest for criminal trespassing and attempted burglary." The crowbar constitutes attempted use of a burglary tool. They'll be transported to the county jail for processing. "Wait, arrest?" Richard found his voice sounding horrified. "We're being arrested." "Yes, sir." "You attempted to force entry to a locked structure on private property without permission. That's a crime." "Deborah said this was legal," Richard protested. "She said we had the authority." "Sir, you'll have the opportunity to explain your side of things at the station. Right now, I need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back." Watching Deborah Hutchins being handcuffed in the rain while her carefully styled hair plastered to her face would have been funny if the whole situation wasn't so insane. Janet was crying, mascara running down her face in black streaks. Richard looked like he might throw up. A third patrol vehicle arrived, and within 20 minutes, all three board members had been transported to county lockup. Deputy Martinez gave me a case number and told me someone from the detective division would follow up with me in the next few days. After the patrol vehicles left, I stood in the rain for a long moment, just trying to process what had happened. Then I went to check on my horses. They were all fine, completely unconcerned about the drama that had unfolded outside their warm, dry barn. Thunder gave me an accusatory look as if to say I'd disturbed his sleep for nothing. I locked up the barn again, made sure everything was secure, and trudged back to my house. It was past 1 in the morning. I was soaked, exhausted, and running on pure adrenaline. I peeled off my wet clothes, took a hot shower, and sat down with a glass of whiskey to calm my nerves. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I kept replaying the scene in my mind. What had Deborah been thinking? What did she plan to do once she got into my barn? Was she going to try to document code violations that didn't exist? Try to harm my horses somehow? The more I thought about it, the more disturbed I became. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a gray sky and muddy ground. I did my usual rounds, feeding horses and checking for any storm damage. Other than some scattered branches and a lot of standing water, my property had come through fine. My barn, that supposedly dangerous structure that required emergency midnight inspection, was perfectly intact. Around 9, my phone rang. It was Tom Chen, my attorney. "Jake, what the hell happened last night? I just got a call from a Detective Williams with the Yellowstone County Sheriff's Department." I filled him in on the entire incident. There was a long silence when I finished. "They tried to break into your barn with a crowbar," Tom said slowly, as if he needed to repeat it to believe it. During a storm, at midnight. Yep, Jake, I've seen some aggressive HOAs in my career, but this is beyond anything I've encountered. This is criminal behavior. I know. The deputies arrested all three of them. What happens now? Well, they're facing criminal trespassing charges at minimum. The attempted burglary charge might stick too, depending on the prosecutor's assessment. Beyond the criminal charges, you have grounds for a civil lawsuit. Harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, possibly even a restraining order against the entire board. I rubbed my eyes. I just want them to leave me alone, Tom. I understand, but you need to protect yourself. These people have shown they're willing to commit crimes. You need to make sure this stops permanently. Tom was right, of course. I agreed to come to his office later that week to discuss our options. In the meantime, I had horses to care for and a normal life to maintain, assuming anything about my life could still be considered normal. The story hit the local news by noon. HOA board members arrested for attempted burglary during storm ran on 3 different Billings news stations. My phone started ringing off the hook. Friends I hadn't heard from in months called to ask if I was okay. Clients who boarded their horses with me wanted to know if their animals were safe. I assured everyone that everything was fine. The horses were never in any real danger, and the situation was being handled by law enforcement. What I didn't expect was the media attention. By afternoon, I had 2 local reporters on my doorstep wanting interviews. I politely declined. I didn't need my face on television. I just wanted this whole mess to go away. But the story had legs, as they say. By the next day, it had been picked up by regional news outlets. By the end of the week, I was seeing it on national news websites. HOA horror story, board arrested for midnight break-in attempt, and when HOAs go too far, Montana man's property rights battle were just some of the headlines. The court of public opinion came down hard on Deborah and her board. The comment sections on news articles were brutal. People shared their own HOA horror stories, and there was widespread outrage at the idea of an HOA targeting someone whose property wasn't even under their jurisdiction. Detective Williams came to my property 3 days after the incident. He was a grizzled veteran in his 50s who looked like he'd seen everything and wasn't impressed by most of it. "Mr. Morrison," he greeted me, shaking my hand. "Thanks for taking the time. I just need to go over a few things for the report." We sat in my living room, and I walked him through the entire history with the HOA, not just the night of the storm. I gave him copies of all the cease and desist letters, the dismissed lawsuit, the false complaints they'd filed, everything Tom had helped me document. Detective Williams looked through it all, occasionally shaking his head. "This is a pattern of harassment, no question. The prosecutor's going to love this. Combined with the attempted break-in, we've got a solid case. What are they being charged with exactly?" Right now, all 3 are charged with criminal trespassing, which is a misdemeanor. We're also pursuing attempted burglary charges. Miss Hutchins is facing an additional charge for possession of burglary tools, that crowbar. Depending on how the prosecutor wants to play it, we might add stalking and harassment charges given the documented pattern of behavior. "Do you think any of it will stick?" Detective Williams leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Morrison, we've got 3 people caught in the act of attempting to break into a locked structure on private property that they have no legal claim to during a storm after midnight, using a crowbar. Your deputy caught them red-handed, and they admitted on scene what they were doing. The only question is whether the prosecutor goes for a plea deal or takes it to trial. The case moved forward through the system faster than I expected. Deborah, Janet, and Richard were arraigned within a week. All 3 pleaded not guilty, which didn't surprise me. Deborah, in particular, seemed constitutionally incapable of admitting she was wrong. Their attorney, a slick-looking guy named Marcus Brennan, who specialized in civil litigation, tried to argue that his clients had been acting in good faith based on a reasonable interpretation of their HOA authority. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia Coleman, shut that argument down fast. "Counselor," Judge Coleman said during one of the preliminary hearings I attended, "there's nothing reasonable about attempting to force entry to a locked barn on property that isn't part of your client's HOA, especially after a court already ruled that Mr. Morrison's property is not subject to their authority. Your clients were trespassing, period." I watched Deborah's face turn red from my seat in the gallery. She whispered furiously to her attorney, who patted her arm in what looked like a futile attempt to calm her down. The preliminary hearing established that there was sufficient evidence for the case to proceed to trial. The attempted burglary charge stuck, along with criminal trespassing. Deborah's possession of burglary tools charge also held. Trial was set for July. In the meantime, Tom helped me file for a restraining order against all 3 board members and the HOA as an entity. The hearing for that took place in mid-May. Deborah showed up to the restraining order hearing dressed like she was going to church, with a navy suit and pearls, clearly trying to look respectable. It didn't help her case. Tom presented all our documentation: the timeline of harassment, the false complaints, the frivolous lawsuit, the cease and desist letters that had been ignored, and finally, the attempted break-in. He also had statements from several of my neighbors who lived within the Sagebrush Meadows development, and who testified that Deborah had told them she was going to make Morrison sell his property one way or another. That testimony was particularly damaging. It established premeditation and intent to harass me off my land. Deborah's attorney tried to paint her as a concerned community leader who had simply been overzealous in her duties, but Judge Coleman wasn't buying it. "Miss Hutchins," the judge said, looking directly at Deborah, "you have engaged in a systematic campaign of harassment against Mr. Morrison for the sole reason that you don't like having his property adjacent to your development. You have no legal authority over his land. You've been told this repeatedly by legal counsel, by law enforcement, and by this court system. Yet you continue to escalate your behavior to the point of committing criminal acts. I'm granting Mr. Morrison's request for a restraining order. You and the other board members are to stay at least 500 feet from Mr. Morrison's property at all times. You are not to contact him directly or indirectly. You are not to file complaints about his property with any agency unless you have actual, legitimate evidence of a code violation. And if you file a false complaint, you'll be in violation of this order. Do you understand?" "Your Honor, I was just trying to protect our community," Deborah started, but the judge cut her off. "Do you understand the terms of this restraining order, Miss Hutchins?" "Yes," Deborah said tightly. "Good. Because if you violate it, you'll be facing contempt charges in addition to your pending criminal charges." The restraining order was a relief. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The constant surveillance stopped. The anonymous complaints stopped. I could work with my horses and live my life without constantly looking over my shoulder. The other residents of Sagebrush Meadows, it turned out, were not uniformly supportive of their HOA board. Once the story became public, I started getting visits from some of them. People apologizing for what had happened and assuring me that not everyone in the development supported Deborah's actions. One couple, the Hendersons, actually brought me a casserole and apologized profusely. "We moved here from California last year," Mrs. Henderson explained, And we thought HOAs were just about keeping neighborhoods nice. We had no idea Deborah was targeting you like this. A lot of us in the development are horrified. It's not your fault, I assured them. I appreciate you coming by. There's actually a movement to recall the entire board, Mr. Henderson added. A petition is going around. People are angry that the HOA spent thousands of dollars on a frivolous lawsuit, and now we're all going to have to deal with the fallout from board members being arrested. The development's reputation is damaged. That was an angle I hadn't considered. The Sagebrush Meadows development was trying to attract new residents and sell the remaining lots. Having news stories about their HOA board being arrested for attempted burglary wasn't exactly great marketing. The recall effort gained traction quickly. Within 3 weeks, enough homeowners had signed the petition to trigger a special election. Deborah, Janet, and Richard were all removed from the board in a landslide vote. A new board was elected, and their first official act was to issue a formal apology to me and to make it explicitly clear in all HOA documentation that my property was not and never would be under their authority. The new HOA president, a retired engineer named Bob Martinez, actually came to my property himself to deliver the apology. Unlike Deborah, he called first and asked if he could visit. "Mr. Morrison," Bob said when I met him at my gate, "I want to apologize on behalf of the homeowners of Sagebrush Meadows for everything you've been put through. What happened was unacceptable, and it doesn't represent the values of our community." "I appreciate that, Bob. I never had a problem with your residents, just with the previous board overstepping their authority." "Understood. I also want you to know that we've updated our bylaws to include explicit language about respecting property boundaries and the rights of adjacent landowners. What Deborah did will never happen again, not on my watch." We shook hands, and I felt a genuine sense of relief. The new board seemed reasonable. Maybe I could finally go back to my quiet life. The criminal trial began on July 15th. The prosecution was being handled by Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Walsh, a sharp woman in her 40s with a reputation for thorough preparation. I'd met with her twice before the trial to go over my testimony. The prosecution's case was straightforward. They had Deputy Martinez's testimony about catching the defendants in the act. They had my testimony about the history of harassment and the events of that night. They had the crowbar as physical evidence. They had statements from the defendants themselves, made at the scene, admitting what they were doing. The defense's strategy seemed to be arguing that the defendants genuinely believed they had the authority to inspect my barn, and that there was no criminal intent. It was a weak argument, but it was all they had. I took the stand on the second day of the trial. Ada Walsh walked me through my history with the property, the timeline of harassment from the HOA, and the events of April 23rd. "Mr. Morrison," Walsh asked, "when you saw the defendants at your barn that night, what went through your mind?" "Fear," I answered honestly. "I had 6 horses in that barn. I didn't know who these people were at first or what they wanted. When I realized it was the HOA board members, I was angry. They'd been harassing me for months, and now they were trying to break into my barn in the middle of a storm. I couldn't understand what they were thinking." "Had you ever given them permission to enter your property?" "Never. I'd explicitly told them multiple times to stay off my land. My attorney had sent cease and desist letters. There was no ambiguity about whether they were welcome on my property. They weren't. The cross-examination was predictable. Marcus Brennan tried to paint me as unreasonable and unwilling to cooperate with the community. "Mr. Morrison, isn't it true that you refused every attempt by the HOA to work with you on community standards?" I refuse to acknowledge their authority over property they have no legal claim to, I corrected. Just like I'd refuse if a stranger walked up and tried to tell me what color to paint my house. They had no standing. But you understand that your property is adjacent to a planned community with certain standards. My property predates that community by decades. I was here first. The developers built around me knowing I wasn't part of their HOA. This isn't complicated. Brennan tried several more angles, but none of them landed. The facts were too clear. Deborah took the stand in her own defense, which turned out to be a mistake. Under direct examination from her attorney, she tried to portray herself as a dedicated community servant who was just concerned about safety. I was worried that Mr. Morrison's barn might collapse in the storm and damage neighboring properties, she testified. I felt it was my responsibility to check. And why didn't you contact Mr. Morrison to ask permission to inspect his barn? Brennan asked. He'd been uncooperative in the past. I didn't think he'd allow it, and with the storm intensifying, I felt we couldn't wait. It sounded almost reasonable until Ada Walsh's cross-examination. Miss Hutchins, you're not a structural engineer, are you? No, but I've served on the HOA board for 3 years, and so you have no professional expertise in evaluating building safety. Well, no, and you didn't bring anyone with professional expertise with you that night, did you? No. In fact, you didn't contact any emergency services, did you? No building inspectors, no county officials, no one with actual authority to evaluate structural safety. There wasn't time. But there was time to drive to Mr. Morrison's property, which is outside your HOA jurisdiction, with a crowbar. Deborah's jaw tightened. I brought the crowbar in case we needed to force entry for safety reasons. For safety reasons, Walsh repeated. Miss Hutchins, isn't it true that you've been trying to force Mr. Morrison to comply with your HOA rules for months, despite having no legal authority over his property? We have a responsibility to maintain community standards. That's not what I asked. Haven't you been harassing Mr. Morrison for months? I wouldn't call it harassment. Walsh pulled out a thick folder. Let's review, shall we? You filed a lawsuit claiming his property was part of your HOA, which was dismissed. You filed false complaints with County Health Services about his septic system. You filed a complaint with the state about his horse boarding operation. You were caught trespassing on his property to measure his barn without permission. All of this after being told repeatedly that you have no authority over his property. Would you like me to continue? Deborah's face was bright red. I was doing my job as HOA president. Your job doesn't extend to property outside your HOA, does it, Miss Hutchins? The property is adjacent to our community. It affects our property values. So you decided to take matters into your own hands by attempting to break into his barn at midnight during a storm. I was conducting an inspection. An inspection you had no authority to conduct, on property you have no legal claim to, using a crowbar to force entry past a locked door. Is that correct? Deborah didn't answer immediately. Her attorney objected, but the judge overruled. Miss Hutchins, please answer the question. I believed I had the authority, Deborah said finally, despite a judge ruling that you didn't. Despite your own attorney advising you after the lawsuit was dismissed that you had no claim to Mr. Morrison's property. There was a long pause. I thought the judge was wrong. That statement hung in the courtroom like a lead balloon. Walsh let it sit for a moment before continuing. So you decided that your judgment was better than a court ruling? That's not what I meant. But that's what you just said. You thought the judge was wrong, so you continued to harass Mr. Morrison, culminating in attempting to break into his barn. No further questions. Deborah stepped down from the witness stand looking shaken. Janet and Richard's testimony didn't help their case either. Both essentially admitted they'd gone along with Deborah's plan because they trusted her judgment as HOA president, which just made them look like they'd blindly followed someone they should have known was acting outside her authority. The trial lasted 5 days. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with a verdict: guilty on all counts for all 3 defendants. Sentencing was set for August. In the meantime, all 3 were released on their own recognizance, with the restraining order still in effect. When sentencing day arrived, I was back in court. Judge Coleman listened to victim impact statements, including one from me about the stress and financial burden the HOA's harassment had caused. Then she handed down her sentences. "Miss Hutchins," Judge Coleman began, "you orchestrated a campaign of harassment against Mr. Morrison that escalated to criminal behavior. You've shown a complete disregard for property rights, legal boundaries, and the authority of this court. Your actions were not those of a concerned community leader. They were the actions of someone who believed the rules didn't apply to them. I'm sentencing you to 1 year in county jail, with all but 90 days suspended. You'll serve 90 days, followed by 2 years of probation. You're also ordered to pay restitution to Mr. Morrison for his legal fees and damages, in an amount to be determined by separate civil proceedings. Additionally, you are prohibited from serving on any HOA board for a period of 10 years. Deborah's face went white. 90 days in jail. The reality of consequences seemed to finally be hitting her. Janet and Richard received lighter sentences since they'd played lesser roles. Each got 30 days in jail, suspended to weekends, and 2 years of probation. They were also ordered to contribute to restitution and banned from HOA service for 5 years. The civil case was settled out of court 3 months later. Between the 3 board members and the HOA's insurance, I received a settlement that covered all my legal fees plus damages. Tom negotiated a clause that also required the HOA to acknowledge in writing, filed with the county, that my property was not and never would be subject to their authority. Deborah served her 90 days in county jail. I heard through the grapevine that she sold her house in Sagebrush Meadows immediately after her release and moved to Arizona. Janet and Richard also eventually moved away, unable to deal with being known in the community as the HOA board members who got arrested for trying to break into someone's barn. The new HOA board under Bob Martinez proved to be reasonable neighbors. We occasionally waved to each other when I was out working with the horses, and they were walking their dogs on the development's trails. There were no more complaints, no more harassment, no more drama. Life returned to normal, or as normal as it gets when you've been through something like that. I continued running my horse boarding operation. My clients stayed loyal, and I actually picked up a few new ones after the publicity died down. Apparently, some people appreciated that I was willing to stand up for my property rights. The story became something of a legend in HOA circles. I got contacted by people from all over the country sharing their own HOA horror stories and asking for advice. I wasn't an expert, but my advice was always the same. Document everything, know your legal rights, and don't be afraid to stand up for yourself when an HOA oversteps. A year after the incident, I was interviewed for an article in a national property rights magazine. The reporter asked me what I'd learned from the experience. I learned that you can't assume everyone will respect boundaries just because they should, I said. Some people need those boundaries enforced by law. I also learned the importance of documentation. If I hadn't kept records of every interaction, every complaint, every violation notice they sent me, it would have been much harder to prove the pattern of harassment. "Do you think HOAs serve a legitimate purpose?" the reporter asked. "Sure, when they're run by reasonable people who understand the limits of their authority. The problem is that HOAs attract a certain type of person who likes having power over their neighbors. When those people get out of control, you get situations like mine. Any advice for homeowners dealing with aggressive HOAs? Know your rights. Document everything. Get a good attorney early if you see problems developing, and don't be afraid to stand up for yourself. Bullies, whether they're on a playground or an HOA board, count on people being too intimidated to fight back. Show them you're not intimidated, and often they'll back down. And if they don't, make sure there are consequences for their actions." The article ran with a photo of me standing in front of my barn with thunder, my gray gelding. The headline was "Standing His Ground: How One Montana Man Beat His HOA." It was a good article, fair and accurate, and it generated another wave of people reaching out with their own stories. Through it all, I just kept living my life. I'd wake up early, feed the horses, muck out stalls, maintain my property, and enjoy the peace of rural Montana. The mountains in the distance, the wide open sky, the sound of horses nickering for their breakfast. This was why I'd bought this property in the first place, and no HOA was going to take that away from me. Looking back now, 3 years after that storm-drenched night when Deborah Hutchins tried to crowbar her way into my barn, the whole thing feels almost surreal. But the legal documents are real. The restraining order is real. The property rights acknowledgement filed with Yellowstone County is real. And most importantly, my peace and quiet are real. I still own my 20 acres. I still board horses. I still have no HOA telling me what color my barn should be or how many animals I can keep on my own land. The Sagebrush Meadows development continues to exist next to my property, but under new management that understands boundaries, both physical and legal. Every once in a while, when a storm rolls through Montana and the rain hammers down on my barn's metal roof, I think about that night. I think about Deborah standing in the rain with a crowbar, so convinced of her own authority that she was willing to commit crimes to enforce it. I think about how close things came to escalating even further. What if I hadn't called the sheriff? What if the deputies hadn't arrived when they did? What if Deborah had actually gotten into my barn and spooked my horses? But those are what ifs. What actually happened is that the system worked. Law enforcement responded. The courts held people accountable. Justice, slow and imperfect as it sometimes is, eventually prevailed. I've been asked if I regret buying property next to a planned community. The answer is no. I was here first. I did nothing wrong. The problem wasn't my location. It was one person's inability to accept that her authority had limits. The experience taught me valuable lessons about standing up for yourself, about the importance of documentation and legal counsel, and about how quickly people in positions of minor power can convince themselves that rules don't apply to them. It also taught me that most people are reasonable. The majority of Sagebrush Meadows residents were horrified by what their HOA board had done. They voted for change. They apologized. They proved that a few bad actors don't define an entire community. These days, my biggest concerns are typical horse owner problems. Is there enough hay to get through winter? Do I need to call the vet for that slight limp thunder's developed? Should I accept another boarding client or am I at capacity? These are good problems to have. They're normal problems. They're the problems I signed up for when I bought this property and decided to build a life here. The barn that Deborah was so convinced was a threat to her community is still standing. It's weathered dozens of storms since that night. including several worse than the one that brought her to my property with a crowbar. The barn is solid, well-maintained, and exactly where it's always been, on my property, under my authority, subject to no HOA but my own judgment. And that's exactly how it should be. Property rights matter. Boundaries matter. The rule of law matters. And sometimes, standing up for what's right means standing in the rain at midnight, protecting what's yours from people who think they know better. I pour myself a cup of coffee most mornings and look out at my barn, my horses grazing in the pasture beyond, and the mountains rising in the distance. This is my property. This is my life. And I fought for it, legally and properly, when someone tried to take it away. The story could have ended differently. Deborah could have accepted the judge's ruling after her lawsuit was dismissed. She could have respected the cease and desist letters. She could have recognized that her authority had limits. But she didn't, and her inability to accept those limits led to her arrest, conviction, and a criminal record that will follow her for the rest of her life. I don't take pleasure in that outcome. I never wanted Deborah to go to jail. I just wanted her to leave me alone. But when someone escalates to the point of attempting to commit burglary, consequences become inevitable. The justice system doesn't run on what people wanted to happen. It runs on what actually happened. And what happened was clear, documented, and witnessed by law enforcement. Sometimes I wonder what Deborah tells people now about why she left Montana. Does she admit what happened? Does she blame me for standing up for my rights? Does she still believe she was justified in her actions? I'll never know, and honestly, I don't need to. Her story ended when she moved to Arizona. Mine continues here, on my land, with my horses, living the life I chose. The sun sets over the mountains most evenings in shades of orange and pink that look like something out of a painting. I'll be in the barn, finishing up evening chores, and I'll pause to watch the light change across the landscape. These are the moments that matter. These are the reasons I fought to keep my property and my rights. Thunder will stick his head over his stall door and nicker, reminding me that sunset watching doesn't fill hay nets. I'll laugh and get back to work, grateful for the simple routine of caring for animals who don't care about HOAs or property disputes, or any of the complicated human nonsense that sometimes intrudes on life. They care about food, water, shelter, and the occasional apple as a treat. It's a simpler existence, and there's wisdom in that simplicity. The story of the HOA board getting arrested made me briefly famous in certain circles. People still occasionally recognize my name when I mention it in conversation about property rights or HOA issues. But fame wasn't the goal. Protection was the goal. Peace was the goal. The right to live on my own land without harassment was the goal. And I achieved those goals, not through violence or revenge, but through documentation, legal process, and a willingness to stand firm when standing firm mattered. That's the real lesson of this whole experience. You don't have to be the loudest person or the most aggressive person. You just have to be right, be persistent, and be willing to let the system work. The system worked. Slowly, sometimes frustratingly, but it worked. And now, years later, I have peace. I have my property. I have my horses. I have my life exactly as I want to live it. That night during the storm feels like it happened to someone else sometimes. But then I'll see Deputy Martinez at the feed store and she'll nod in recognition. Or I'll file my annual property taxes and see the notation about the HOA acknowledgement. Or I'll talk to Tom Chen about some minor legal question, and he'll reference the barn incident as shorthand for the whole saga. It happened. It was real, and it's over. That's the best ending I could have hoped for. Not revenge, not drama, just resolution and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that justice prevailed and property rights were upheld. Some stories don't need explosive endings. Sometimes the best ending is just getting back to normal life, with the legal right to live that life protected and affirmed. I'm sitting on my porch now, watching another storm roll in from the west. The clouds are dark and heavy with rain, and I can hear thunder rumbling in the distance. My horses are already in the barn, safe and dry. The barn door is locked. My property is secure. And if anyone tries to break into my barn during this storm, well, I have the sheriff's department on speed dial, a documented history of standing up for my rights, and a legal system that's already proven it will hold trespassers accountable. But I don't think anyone will try. The lesson has been learned, not just by Deborah and her board, but by anyone who might think that an HOA title gives them authority over property that isn't theirs. The rain starts to fall. Fat drops that splatter on the porch railing. I take a sip of my coffee and watch the storm come in. It's just weather. It's just rain. It's just another Montana evening on my property, living my life, exactly as I have the right to do, and that's worth fighting for.